When you look at the Empire during its heyday, it's easy to be awed by its immense power and military strength. You might even assume that this military-first dictatorship has what's necessary to bring peace and stability to the galaxy. I mean, such organizations have always been appealing to young boys who are fascinated with tanks, soldiers, airplanes, and war.
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
All you really need is a terrific enemy to rally your people against, and suddenly you have a long line of die-hard supporters who are willing to be your cannon fodder. But what lies internally in the Empire is oftentimes misunderstood by political novice and young enthusiastic fascists. All they can see is that white, shiny veneer which coats over a rotting corpse that is the interior of this government. The Galactic Empire, at its core, especially in those earlier years, wasn't all that different from the Galactic Republic, albeit some large changes at the leadership position. But whether it's the Bureau of Statistics or the Republic Navy, the Empire's day-to-day operations remained mostly unchanged.
6 on our hands. I don't think you're gonna want to have a 337-6 off your starboard side now, would you, sir?
Shuttle S-257, requesting your emergency access code.
Copy that, sir. Priority Protocol 7.
I mean, how else does an old clone who's been out of the loop for almost 2 decades understand all the latest Imperial protocols and codes?
Cody and I practically invented these emergency protocols back in the Clone War. Trust me, the codes are good.
Palpatine came from within the system, and he wasn't stupid enough to get rid of the foundation of the galactic government. He just wanted to work better for his own purposes. Palpatine, like most dictators, display behavior that we usually see in narcissists. It's actually highly prevalent in most leadership positions. And, like, to put yourself out there as a leader, you have to have a pretty high ego to begin with. But once that ego becomes unchecked, well, it can consume that very individual. I mean, you have to be a bit crazy to take on the challenge of running an entire galaxy-wide government in the first place. And oftentimes, these type of leaders, they don't start off as monsters, especially in, like, democratically elected systems. Oftentimes, these leaders start out believing in the system, and they actually want to do right by the people. But if you stay in power long enough and you get used to the feel of power, soon you'll begin to question the system and wonder why everyone shouldn't just listen to you. Expedite the process of making the galaxy a better place. Soon, instead of focusing on running the government properly, you'll be focused on how you can purge your critics and opposition, checks and balances be damned, and soon you'll be surrounded by sycophants who will blind you completely on the reality of your situation. No, you don't have a bunch of phantom fleets roaming in the Outer Rim keeping the galaxy safe. It's complete chaos out there. And this oftentimes happens when a leader is in power for too long, and that's because no one really comes into office actually prepared for the job. It's a hands-on learning experience. But after one term, you begin to understand how things work, and by the end of the second term, well, you believe you master the entire system when, in reality, you've probably just gotten too used to the position in the first place. By the time you take on your ill-advised third term, unless you're just like, the perfect human being, it's really hard to not let that ego and experience create some authoritarian tendencies. And it's at that point, you come to the realization, screw ruling by committee, it's time to dictate. Now, in all fairness, Palpatine was probably a dictator from the very beginning. He didn't gradually slide towards authoritarianism, he just revealed his true intentions at one point. But the reality is, even Palpatine was at his best when he was being constantly challenged by his peers in the government. He was at his best when his own inner circle, the Loyalist Committee, was made up of individuals like Padme Amidala, Bail Organa, and Mon Mothma. Convincing these guardians of the Republic's democracy to support his military-first agenda was absolute political genius. A life with no adversity and challenges, well, that makes a person weaker. It also tends to exaggerate some more negative personality traits that we might have that we usually try to keep hidden from others in social settings because we still want to work with others. But when everyone's working for you, who cares? Be yourself, even if that self is a complete dickhead. For Palpatine, it was a literal transformation of his face. He went from smooth face to wrinkly gray scrotum face. But far more concerning was how he would run the Empire. You see, dictators, they really hate independent institutions like the judicial branch, BB. They might want a Senate or Parliament so that they can claim that they're his representation, but they really just want everything beneath their control. And it's a gradual process to wear down all of these independent institutions and replace them with your own people. In the early days of the Empire, there were even old holdouts in the armed forces who were still secretly loyal to the Republic and wanted nothing to do with Palpatine's empire. I mean, the biggest problem with dictators is that even the most powerful ones can never get 100% compliance from their people, and so most dictatorships, they really do focus a lot on waging war against their own people. which is like the worst expenditure of resources and political capital. There are always going to be individuals resisting the Empire or simply competent public servants who want to do their jobs properly, but for one reason or another, whatever they're doing runs counter to the dictator's overall objective, which again is usually very flawed. One person can only see so much, absorb so much information. The point of ruling by committee is that you have a bunch of specialists who focus on one small area of governance, and hopefully those individuals will be better suited at doing that than just one dictator who basically controls everything. Without these very important specialists, suddenly your Star Destroyer fleet is running out of hypermatter fuel, your stormtroopers are running out of food, entire planets are suffering from blackouts, leading to decreased economic activity in the entire sector. Or better yet, you foolishly devote massive resources to grandiose projects like the Death Star that serve very little strategic purpose. Good leaders are willing to set aside their ego and work with people across the aisle as long as they're competent and good at their job. But what dictators like Palpatine do instead is replace those specialists with his own people, individuals who might be trained in doing the job they're required to do, but far more important is their loyalty, their personal loyalty to Palpatine. This is why authoritarian regimes are almost never as efficient as governments with checks and balances in place. If you look at the Empire closely, it operates more like a mafia than it does a legitimate government. And this collection of warlords that Moff Gideon is speaking to here are a great example of exactly that. The second that Palpatine is removed from the equation, the squabbling began pretty quickly. Aside from the faction under Grand Admiral Ray Sloan, every Moff, Admiral, and General worth his salt has probably collected their resources and started their own little fiefdom. And this was known, this was expected to happen, and this is how Palpatine really set everything up. And see, Palpatine was a vindictive piece of shit. I mean, his contingency plan in the case of his death was more like a punishment levied against the Empire for its failure to protect him from dying in the first place. Operation Cinder literally targeted some of the most loyal Imperial worlds and devastated them. In the past, I actually called this a scorched earth policy. But again, it's just Palpatine being a little vindictive shit, and also a Sith Lord. Now, one of the things that Palpatine actually spent a lot of time on creating was a training pipeline for future Imperial officers. This Imperial Academy system, whether they realized it or not, was set up with similar principles to the Sith academies of old. I mean, these were ruthless schools in which the standards for success were extremely high, but students were also unofficially encouraged to sabotage, trick, and even kill their peers, as long as no one caught you in the act. As a matter of fact, if you successfully pulled something like this off, you were usually rewarded. And so just like the Sith academies of old, the Imperial academies, despite all their rules and regulations, were kind of like the jungle. It was every man and woman for themselves. And so what you see at the highest level of Imperial leadership are not individuals who are skilled and good at working together, an important part of any organization that wants to properly function. Instead, what you have are a collection of some of the most ruthless, backstabbing, social climbing scumbags the galaxy has ever seen. I mean, Rogue One showcases this the best. The heated struggle between Moff Tarkin and Orson Krennic was really an epic failure on the Empire's part, which resulted in Tarkin using the Death Star on Krennic, immediately after he essentially stole the project from him. Now, the power dynamics in the Imperial Remnant seem to be heading in the same direction. The three individuals in this meeting here that are worth mentioning are Gilad Pellaeon, Commandant Brendol Hux, and Moff Gideon. Gilad Pellaeon is a famous legend character who's just recently been brought back. He was as much of a protege to Thrawn as Eli Vanto is in the new canon. Clearly, after the death of so many important Imperial leaders, Thrawn is now rightfully seen as the most capable leader amongst them. Even all of these scheming warlords seem to respect Thrawn, although Pellaeon seems to be the only one who really knows where exactly he is, and that is the only cards he holds currently. Commandant Brendol Hux, father of Armitage Hux, was in charge of the Arcanist Academy before the Empire collapsed. He was in the business of creating soldiers, primarily infantry soldiers. He was also a member of the Shadow Council. This is like the post-Empire Imperial Remnant High Council that was run by Gallius Rex. This would eventually turn into the First Order. He, in theory, should have access to the largest amounts of resources because of this. Although there is a reason why he's not in The Force Awakens. I mean, Chrome alert. And then finally, we have Moff Gideon, a cunning and vicious man with his own plans and machinations. As an ISB officer, he's technically a civilian political officer, but he clearly was able to use his intelligence gathering skills to convince a number of people to follow him. Now, despite how terrible of a position the Empire is in right now, despite how easily the New Republic could just rally itself and destroy the Imperial Remnant should it find the political will to do so, these Imperial leaders still do not trust one another at all. They give resources out as favors that need to be returned one day, and this meeting of Imperial leaders is as much of a poker game as it is a briefing on what their future plans are. And this is why no matter how cunning and devious Moff Gideon is, he will ultimately fail. Not only because he's like a bad guy in a Disney franchise, but because he's not just fighting the Mandalorians or the New Republic, he's also fighting several different factions within the Empire. I mean, this is another lesson that Palpatine learned from the Sith, right? The biggest threat to a Sith is their apprentice followed by their underlings. But having your underlings and apprentices constantly focused on fighting each other for whatever scraps you let fall off the table, well, that'll keep them focused on killing each other instead of combining their forces and overthrowing you. The only problem is now Palpatine is gone, and what's left is a bunch of squabbling Imperial Warlords. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.